we notice that the crucifixion in Mark's gospel is quite different than it is especially in Luke and John because of the sheer starkness of the way in which Jesus dies with no kind of final words of forgiveness or farewell or trust, but just,
Right.
my God, why have you forsaken me? One reason that the Gospel of Mark has puzzled lots of people is that the resurrection also seems to end, the resurrection story, chapter 16, seems to end oddly. What's going on there?
Yeah, we get an empty tomb, but nobody to tell about it. And so 16:8, the last words of the gospel are, the woman went away and didn't tell anybody because they were afraid.
Yeah.
Right. So everything toward which this gospel has been building, including the climax of the cross, ends up resting on how these people are going to respond to this resurrection, and nobody's going to hear about it, at least at the end of 16:8. It's the great puzzle. It's what keeps you and me reading.
Absolutely,
right?
right.
It's the great puzzle of Mark's gospel, and everybody's tried to help him. Right? Copyists tried to help him and put a little more on the end so that it would be a little more like Matthew or more like Luke or more like John.
Just the endings. I'm being older than you. Grew up with the King James Bible,
Right.
And King James Bible did not end with chapter 16, verse 8. It ended with chapter 16, verse 20.
Right.
And he appears several times, and he deals with Mary Magdalene and does many wonderful things. But you're saying that's not the earlier copy, right?
Right, and it's consensus, as close as you get to consensus
Yeah.
among scholars, that 16:8 would have been the ending because it's the most represented in the manuscripts, and also because it makes the least sense,
Yeah.
which means copyists seem to be trying to help it out elsewhere.
Yeah.
And you know what that leaves us with, having lived 16 chapters or 15 prior chapters,
Right.
is a lot of unfinished business that when we get to the end of 16:8, if we're in an audience listening to this, feels like it's not yet done.
Yeah.
And part of that is because we come to it having heard other gospels, right? So,
Of course,
So
yeah.
Jesus isn't going to make breakfast on the beach
yeah,
here, and
yeah.
Jesus isn't
Yeah.
going to
Where's
go to
Mary
Emmaus
Magdalene?
here. And
I know she's supposed to be there.
yeah, and so we partly get our expectations elsewhere, but there are plenty in Mark's gospel to have us thinking, is this really over at the end? Because back in chapter 1, a little thing, back in chapter 1, John the Baptist announced Jesus by saying, one is coming after me who's mightier than I am, and that one will baptize you with the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
We haven't seen any
We
of
have
that.
that, right.
We haven't
Yeah,
seen any of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And throughout the gospel, we have the expectation that at some point, some disciple is going to get what the narrator in 1:1 and God at the baptism and at the transfiguration and the demons and then Jesus at his own trial all know, which is, and then finally the centurion all know, which is that this is the Son of God, and none of them in the course of 16 chapters have yet gotten it.
Yeah.
We also expected that they would somehow come back around to understanding that this denying of self that Jesus called for at Caesarea Philippi to Peter, this take up your cross and follow me, let him deny himself, that this will somehow sink in sometime, and it hasn't.
Yeah.
Through 3 passing predictions, they just keep not getting it.
Yeah.
And so by the end of this, and you reminded me earlier in this afternoon that in the Transfiguration we hear, they won't get this until after the resurrection, right? Well, there's nobody there to get it after the resurrection in 16:8. So there are a whole lot of loops that haven't been closed in the world of the gospel, not just in our expectations because we know more than this gospel, in the world of the gospel at the end of 16:8. And I think that's Mark's sort of clever way of doing something that you brought up a long time ago in these conversations, which is saying this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Because if I'm in a room listening to this, and I have come in, as we talked about earlier, saying I'm going to watch those disciples. Because those disciples are my key to what I need to do. And if Papias is right, this is happening in Rome, and we may be in post-Nero times, right? but doesn't need to be that. We see in chapter 13 they're expecting persecutions and maybe experiencing them. What they need is courageous disciples,
Yeah.
and so they listen the whole time to see what they're supposed to look like, and they don't get it. At the end of the gospel, they still haven't
Yeah.
got it. And so I imagine this silence in the room afterwards, this sort of disappointed, almost angry silence, in which they are looking for
Yeah.
where are we going to hang our hat?
Yeah.
And then someone remembers, wait a second, we know Peter went on to do martyrdom,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we know these guys, and the stories start to fly.
Yeah.
We know these guys eventually got
This
it.
is not the end of the.
It's not the end of the
This is the end of the written story. It's not the end of the gospel.
It's the end of the beginning,
It's the end of the beginning.
right?
Yeah.
And so that moment of recognition raises the next question, which is how? How did they change from
Yeah.
these sniveling guys
Yeah.
that we see running away at every chance to the courageous ones
Yeah.
who we know about from stories around campfires?
Yeah.
And in that moment, they are, I think, driven to realize that whether the women ran away afraid from the tomb or not, somehow Jesus found these guys. And they experienced the risen Christ. They got, Holy Spirit baptism. They understood at some point what this downward direction of discipleship looked like. And because otherwise we don't end up with the apostles that they knew
Yeah.
from the disciples'
Yeah.
raw material.
Yeah,
Does that
yeah.
make sense?
It does make sense. It makes sense. Doesn't mean I'm happy with the solution to the puzzle entirely,
Right.
because it still puzzles me.
Right.
The most recent kind of illustration I've had in my own reading that helps a little bit, and it's reverse in terms of being further tragedy, not greater triumph at the end of the story. But I've been reading Wolf Hall, which is the new retelling of the Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII story through the eyes of Thomas Cromwell. And it ends with Anne Boleyn still alive, well, and as happy as one can be with Henry VIII as a husband, which is not very happy, as a matter of fact. But we know what the story won't. In the story world, that's the end of the story. We, living in a world beyond, know that she's the next to go. And that Henry VIII, who's wandering off to see Jane Seymour that weekend, will choose Jane as the next lucky recipient of his affections. And the novel is richer because we know a history beyond the novel.
Right.
I think in some ways the Gospel of Mark is richer because we know that the end of that story told is not the end of the story lived.
Right.
That this is a transition from the way the story begins to the way the story goes on. I've also recently suspected, that the silence of the women is not only contrasted with what must happen to them and to the disciples later, it's contrasted with us. We tell. All right, you guys go tell. Right? If we were left to the silent first generation, we might not make it. But now we, in 70 AD, 68 AD, whatever it is, we're in the business of telling this story. We're not invited to silence.
And 2010 AD, right?
And 2010,
Yeah.
we're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
invited to silence.
Yeah, and I think, we've marked along the way, we've noted along the way Mark's cleverness and how much we see him arraying things so that messages come from more than just the individual unit of a paragraph.
Yeah.
And we therefore can look back and ask, are there hints? We saw side by side 2 synagogue healings and we compared them. We saw side by side 2 bread miracles and we compared them, and Mark seemed to want us to compare them.
Right.
I don't know. This is sort of, I don't know whether this is advanced placement listening for an early Christian crowd or for a contemporary crowd, whether it's making Mark over clever. But in chapter 8, just before the scene at Caesarea Philippi, you get this very strange episode that the other Gospels don't want to repeat, in which Jesus heals a man of his blindness in 2 stages.
Right.
And if we sit with Mark long enough, we realize that when something weird happens, we ought to watch it and see if there's message in it. There's a first stage in which Jesus puts mud on the guy's eye and asks, "Can you see?" And the guy says, "I can see, but it's like trees walking around."
Right.
People are like trees walking around. And then he cleanses his eyes and he can see fully. That comes just before Jesus and Peter at Caesarea Philippi, where Peter says, "You're the Messiah," and essentially Jesus quietly says, "You're right." and then
but not right enough.
and then Jesus says, "I'm going to die,"
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Peter says,
yeah,
"No."
yeah.
So Peter's wrong.
Peter's
so
got half
he's-
vision.
He sees
Yeah.
he sees people like trees walking
Yeah,
along,
yeah.
which means that it's another one of these bits that tries to set an expectation
Yeah,
that isn't realized in the pages
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the Gospel through
yeah.
16:8. If that's the case, and again, who knows if that gets tracked when I get to 16:8 and I'm in an ancient
I know.
listening
Yeah, yeah,
audience. Do I look back and say, "Aha,
yeah,
that's
I
what
know.
was happening in 8"? But for those of us who get the luxury of going back
Yeah.
and looking at it over and over and reading it, that's awfully nice.
Yeah.
It signals something that gives hope that 16:8 isn't the last word, which we know by
Yeah,
the end,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Is
The other theme that does that for me, and I just confess, I've stopped worrying as much about what the first century heard than I used to, because it's unanswerable. I just among the things I'll never know are what did a first century audience hear when they hear that. That gives me total liberty to say now that I've seen it, it must be there, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
now that I've seen this must be there,
Right.
and if they missed it, alas for them.
Yeah.
But how often the theme of fear comes up in this gospel. And the very last thing that happens with these women in Mark 16 is they're afraid.
right.
The next to the last word is afraid.
Right.
And the last word is because, which is almost mid-sentence, not even,
yeah.
not just mid-thought, but mid-sentence. Time and again, Jesus contrasts faith with fear and says, don't be fearful, only have faith. And the one I remember most clearly is when he's walking across the sea and they're terrified. And just when they're most afraid, he joins them in the boat and comforts them. And my strong suspicion for a long time has been that if we read Mark's gospel through, seeing that fear is always contrasted with faith and comes just before promise, that we know fear can't be the last word now either. That there's that next word which lies beyond the words on the page, and that has to do with faith and comfort and reappearance.
Yeah, that's, and now you're I mean, at the beginning of these sessions, you asked me, why do I keep reading this gospel?
Yeah.
And I gave an answer about how quickly things come at us, and that's part of it. And I gave an answer about how quickly Jesus starts to reveal who he is through actions instead of words, and that's part of it. But when you get to the end of the day, what this gospel does is it lays out the possibility that God can help us amidst those myriad fears we have, that God never lets fear be the last
Right.
word. And it's true on the cross,
Right.
right? And it's true,
True
in
in the resurrection too.
Yeah, and so at the end of the day, the answer deepens to why should we keep reading this book? Why is it helpful for the church? There's a profound message of help. There's a profound message that the things that seem final and thwarting are not so. That's a good reason.
I think you can't get better news than that. Let's stop.